ただいまより
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We now begin the global conference commemorating the 10th anniversary of Roppongi Hills Innovative City Forum, the Mori Art Museum Session 1 and 2. This forum is being held to commemorate the 10th anniversary of Roppongi Hills, organized jointly by the Mori Memorial Foundation, Mori Art Museum, and Arc Hills. The theme of the forum is the new design of cities and lifestyle. We are focusing on the state-of-the-art technology, culture, creativity, and city development, urban development, gathering opinion leaders from different parts of the world. In this session 1 and 2 of the Mori Art Museum, we will be looking at the history of art foretells the future. I have the honor of serving as the MC, and I'd like to now introduce the speakers and the moderators. Mr. David Elliott is the founding director of the Mori Art Museum. He is currently a curator and writer who has directed contemporary art museums and institutions in Oxford, Stockholm, Tokyo, Istanbul, Sydney, and Kiev. He is currently working on 2 traveling exhibitions for the UK and USA. He is the president of the board of Triangle Art Network, Gasworks in London, and the Asia Advisory Board of the Guggenheim Museum, and guest professor in curatorship at the Chinese University in Hong Kong. He's a specialist in Soviet and Russian avant-garde. Mr. Manuel Borja-Villel, director of the Museo Nacional, Centro de Arte, Reina, Sofia in Madrid. He was the director of the Fundació Antoni Tapias in Barcelona, and he directed the Museum d'Art Contemporani de Barcelona. From January 2008, he is the director of the Museo Nacional, Centro de Arte, Reina, Sofia. He is active globally. Mr. Shuji Takashina is the director of Ohara Museum of Art, Kurashiki. He is the art critic, and he is the professor emeritus of the University of Tokyo. And he's a former director of the National Museum of Western Art, Tokyo. He is versed with the art and art history. In 2000, he was awarded the medal with Purple Ribbon. In 2002, the Japan Art Academy Prize and Unshi Prize. He also has been awarded many prizes globally. This session is moderated by Mami Kataoka, Chief Curator of the Mori Art Museum. Ms. Kataoka, please come up on the stage. After working for a private sector think tank where she conducted research into cultural policies, urban development, and arts and cultural products, Ms. Kataoka became chief curator at the Tokyo Opera City Art Gallery in 1997. In 2003, she joined the Mori Art Museum in Tokyo. Beginning in 2007, she concurrently served for 2 years as international curator at the Hayward Gallery in London. In 2012, she became the guest curator at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. We now begin session 1 of the Mori Art Museum. The floor is now yours, Ms. Kataoka.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. As the moderator introduced, today we have this Mori Art Museum session. This is the 3rd program of the Innovative City Forum. We have discussed the possible lifestyles 20 years from now, but in this session today, we would like to consider what we can learn from the history about our future. The Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, said that wise men learn from history fools learn from experiences. Yes, I do believe that experiences and histories, both of them are very critical, but we want to utilize history as a clue to understand our future. Mori Art Museum, since its inception, made a proposal on art and lives, trying to present various questions, how life, society, art can be interrelated through exhibitions we organize. Especially, we are faced with many unsolved challenges, including the aftermath of East Japan earthquake. There is heightened sense of emergency, but if you look at around the world, we have global connection in terms of politics and economy as well. And an event which happened outside your territory can also affect your own life. And where Asia fits in the whole world, considering that we are expected to play different roles than the historical roles we have played. On the other hand, 20 years ago in 1993, since 1980s up to the early part of 1990s, we have seen the major upheavals in the global map with the collapse of Soviet Union, the end of Cold War, and the end of bubble economy in Japan as well. All of these seems to be fresh in my memory. It feels like they happened recently, but it seems also all of these happened a long time ago. The coming 20 years may not feel so long. And at the same time, we know that the whole world has continued on with a series of major changes. In the midst of social and political changes, the art of the time, what kind of voice does the art of the time has had? What role does it play? Did it play? Same questions are now asked to modern art that we create today. In terms of the order of speeches, I'd like to invite Mr. David Elliott, followed by Mr. Manuel Borja-Villel, and Mr. Shuji Takashina. Each speaker will have 20 minutes. And then after that, four of us would like to have internal discussion. Now I'd like to invite Mr. David Elliott, please.
Minasama, konnichiwa.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Unfortunately, I'm going to speak in English this morning. Sorry.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you very much, Mori Art Museum, not only for having provided this amazing platform for 10 years for modern and contemporary art, but also for inviting me back here to help celebrate this 10 years. It's a great time. And just really to start off by telling you a short story about art and life. Now, those of you with a long memory will remember that when we started off the Mori Art Museum, art and life was one of the key ideas that we were working with. And this is really to make the obvious clear, because the obvious isn't always, it's sometimes obfuscated by a few things. The very simple idea that contemporary art runs parallel to life, is absolutely of life, and sometimes actually about life, and without this vital relationship, the whole activity of making art and viewing it becomes either self-indulgent or empty. And within our values that we have as human beings, that's how we can learn to appreciate, to interpret, and actually to let the art live within us. So, somewhat ironically, this work, neon work by Bruce Nauman from 1967, the true artist helps the world by revealing mystic truths. I mean, his tongue is firmly in his cheek when he makes this, but there's an element of truth in it. And those of you, again, with a long memory will remember having seen this here at the Mori Art Museum in the first exhibition, Happiness, a Survival Guide for Art and Life. And along with this work in the same gallery, they were virtually next to each other, one of the great Zen painters of the 18th century, Torei Enji, one of these wonderful calligraphic circles. And so you have the spiral and the circle, and that's all there in what we're talking about today. Now, this relationship to life, and I think it's something which is particularly on the focus here in Japan after the awful events, after the earthquake and tsunami and the nuclear disaster in Tohoku. And artists are finding it hard to respond to it, yet, as you will see from upstairs, they are managing. And this response is a very important part of the process of healing. And I just want to show you this work by Louise Bourgeois. Her great Maman, the big spider, is outside here. And it's a work, an installation, just a little bit of that installation that she made near the beach at Krabi in Thailand in memory of the many thousands of people who died as a result of the appalling earthquake and tsunami of 2004. So, I mean, art does have this role as well of bringing people together. It's not only a memorial, a commemoration, it's actually a bringing together, a coagulation of the present to provide this jump forward into a future where, of course, none of us know what will happen. And of course, this is also very much written into the history of contemporary art. Yoko Ono, whose work you know, another work from the Happiness exhibition, The Men Piece. It's an interactive performance in which we all can participate as we stick together these bits of broken crockery to make completely new objects which have no relationship to the original form of the ceramic. Or this, Joseph Beuys, shamanistic character, of the 70s and 80s, the famous performance he made, I Like America and America Likes Me, where he was holed up with a coyote in a space, I think, for 3 days in a gallery in New York. And this is the artist as revealing mystic truths. So I don't think his tongue was in his cheek when he made this work. Or Marcus Coates, a young British artist who actually I first met in Super Deluxe, this wonderful little bar and performance space not 200 yards away from here when he was a young visiting artist. And as you can see, he's a shaman too. He wears this rabbit on his head. It's a kind of reference to Joseph Beuys, who believed in the vitality of nature by using felt and fat, and he often had a hare's foot relating to him. And he's been healing a very poor area of London through these performances and rock performances, the Elephant and Castle. Well, I think that this relationship with a way of looking at the world, trying to make things better, is very much inscribed in the early years of modernity. And this iconic painting by Jacques-Louis David, The Death of Marat, commemorating, we could say, one of the victims of the French Revolution. Yet he was killed by Charlotte Corday, the daughter of one of the people who he himself had engineered the death of. And Marat was a Committee of National Security, a leading member of that, and largely responsible for the terror in which hundreds of people were guillotined as part of the French Revolution. Yet he's presented here as a Pieta, as a dying Christ in a new secular society. And I think it really does indicate the ambivalence and the multi-layered aspect of these images with which we work. And when we talk about revolution can be a good thing, change, things moving over, there's a horrible side to it. First comes the revolution, then comes the terror. I mean, it does seem to be a rule, which we've seen time after time again. And then national self-determination, nationalism. This wonderful painting by Francisco Goya, the 3rd of May, which he made some years after the event, not too long. It was still very much fresh in people's minds. But really the start of the wars of independence against Napoleon in Spain, and it's part of 2 paintings. The first one is the troops, Napoleon's troops, fighting against the insurgents, and this is the first guerrilla war that we can talk of. And then the second, the payback, Napoleon's troops killing these heroes and these heroic figures as they stand up for what they believe in, for freedom, liberty, all these great ideas. Things get more impacted, more complicated as the 20th century draws on. particularly around the time of the First World War. This is a wonderful painting by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner at Potsdamer Platz in Berlin, which was in the Tokyo, Berlin, Tokyo show, which was held here, I think, in 2005. And it's a scene, the busy central metropolitan area, and showing women, fashionably dressed women, but anyone who sort of knew what was going on at the time would realize these are not any women, they're prostitutes. And one of the ways in which they drummed up trade at the time of the First World War, when many men were dying in the trenches, was actually they adopted the clothes of widows. So they had a veil across their face, which gave them, of course, anonymity, but also it signified that they were up for sale. And this Gothic pointed, anxious, tense painting very much expresses the feelings, the sense of implosion, which one can see throughout all the art of that time. You get the same feeling in this self-portrait without eyes by Yorozu Tetsugoro. Or Ludwig Meidner's apocalyptic vision. Now, this was made in 1913, so before the First World War started. And he started making a whole series of this kind of apocalyptic view of the world the previous year, when a comet threatened the Earth, and people saw in this a great portent of doom and disaster for the future. And you can see in these paintings there's a trace of this comet or the black sun shining in a dark heaven. Fumon-gyo, Japanese artist, picking up very much the same kind of feeling. This, but from a natural point of view, is obviously strongly related to Franz Marc, another German expressionist painting, but also something of the same apocalyptic spirit of Meidner. And then a painting that was here for Tokyo, Berlin, another one, the revolution on the barricades, a symbol, an image that repeats itself time and time again through the 20th century. And then what happens after the revolution? Well, you have the backlash. And after the First World War, very brief revolutions that followed it, what happens? The pillars of society, the fat cats, the profiteers, the arms dealers take over. And this is George Gross's view of such a society. Not very flattering. In fact, you could make portraits like this today if you look at the arms dealers as well, I think. A whole bunch of young Japanese artists were in Berlin at the beginning of the 1920s and came back, brought ideas, added their own ideas to it in their version of Dadaism. They formed a Mavo group. And Nakahara Minoru, as you can see, was absolutely in the middle of this. I think this was probably made in Berlin. You can see a little bit of German there, Tanz. Well, it's sort of written wrong way around, but meaning dance, and it's showing the kind of falling apart of society, the decadence of the society. Or this a little bit later, in the 30s, the influence of Salvador Dali, and this is a real enigma for me. It's a painting by Namba Kazuko, not a very well-known artist, but Chiang Kai-shek, Where Are You Going? It's I think it's a nationalist painting, actually. It's very critical. Chiang Kai-shek at this time was flirting with the Japanese, and perhaps he would go on their side or not. And I think this is a painting, you can see the nationalist flag, Chinese flag there at the bottom, a painting which reflects the uncertainty of those times. Or this, Tsuda Seifu, the awful militarism of the 1930s in Japan, one of the most outspoken and heartfelt cries of outrage and humanity made at that time. Or this, Yamawaki Iwao, the only artist to have actually chronicled at the time the Nazi takeover of the Bauhaus. He was a student there. He was a young Bauhausler when it had moved to Berlin, and this work, it shows the brown shirts are marching into the Bauhaus. Or another perspective, not shown here in Tokyo, or at least certainly not at the Mori Art Museum, but a show that I made back in 1980 of this marvelous painter called Jose Clemente Orozco, a muralist one of the great Mexican muralists. And in 1923, 1925, he made this, and it's a fragment of a huge mural project he made in the center of Mexico. And it's called A Scrap Heap of Ideologies. Now, what vision has this man got in 1923 to look at the French Jacobin cap, the swastika, before Hitler had hardly got going, the fasces of Mussolini, and there they are, they're all in the scrap heap, and over them presiding is a vulture feeding on the flesh. He used the same idea a little later in Guadalajara, in the Palace of Government there, the battle of ideologies. So from the distance of Mexico, looking over to Europe, looking at the world, what was happening in the world, this incredible clarity that he had. Or this, the revolution again, the father of the Mexican Revolution, the priest Hidalgo, looking at Mexico then in the late 1930s, Hidalgo, the revolution of 1810, and outraged at the corruption and stupidity and violence that had come out of it. And there he's cleaning the Palace of Government, the national courts, of all the horrible things that had happened. Or this, Xu Bing, Chinese artist with whom I'm sure you're all very familiar. It's a Xerox poster he made in the early years of 1989, just before the events of June the 4th. He was part of that student movement. And he's taken the Michelangelo touch as the symbol for this new change. Now, we know it kind of ended in tragedy. I mean, thousands of people were killed on that day, on June the 4th. Somehow it slapped back. No one would have imagined at the time that it would, but it did. And Chinese artists looking today at the different things that are happening, looking back at the heroism of the early Maoist years and at China as it is now. This is by Zhu Xixi, Liberate Beiping. That's a very famous painting, which he's done his own version of on the right. And then looking at these scenes of young people today, rather disillusioned and lost. Or Stelios Vatakis, a young Greek artist. This was a site-specific work he made for the Biennale in Kiev, which I was running. And he's looking back at Ukrainian history, at the story of the anarchist Makhno, and looking at the very ambivalent history, which no one talks about. The fact that the anarchists are often thought to be the good guys. You know, the Soviets were terrible, the Poles were brutal, they all were killing the Jews. But guess what? Makhno, who had his own cavalry and brigades, was doing absolutely the same thing. And that kind of complicated, alternative view comes out in this work. Or this Vasily Tsgolov, a Ukrainian artist, and he's looking at the revolution in Ukraine today. And he's taken the first words of Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto. The specter of revolution is haunting the whole of Europe. And he's taken this, and what is it? It's geriatrics with pitchforks running down the street with skeletons chasing US dollars. Yeah. Sound familiar? Or this, a work made by Lutz Becker, collaged out of So using the films of Alexander Dovzhenko, he's making a kind of elegy for the idea of revolution, the heroic imagery of revolution, yet also the terrible failure of it, and its denial of nature, which comes through in this. It's 20 minutes on 3 different screens. Yan Fudong, very well known for his 7 intellectuals in a bamboo forest. This is a place near where he was brought up, a very poor village which has no means of economic support, in which dogs roam the land outside, and it's literally a world of dog eat dog. Or this, Hans Harker, 3 panels from his work called A Breed Apart, made in 1978, which actually I commissioned when I was director at the museum in Oxford. And it's about apartheid in South Africa, and how Britain, although it claimed to not support apartheid, how it did. It's called A Breed Apart because that is the language of the marketing for the new Jaguar car in South Africa. Jaguar, a breed apart, an irony-free zone, made by Leyland Vehicles, and their selling logo at that time was "Nothing Can Stop Us Now." And there, in 2 more of these panels, you see how British Leyland's Land Rovers are being used. They're being used against the UN resolutions for military purposes in suppressing the black townships all around South Africa. So, in spite of what we said, what we did was a different thing. And in this work, in a very, very eloquent way, it's now in the Tate Gallery in London, if you wish to see it, Harker really put his finger on the hypocrisy of colonialism. And then just last, to end with, I'm going to show you just a very short extract of a film by Stodelat, a Petersburg collective. Stodelat means what is to be done. And it's also the name of a pamphlet written by Lenin in 1903, as well as a very famous book by Nikolai Chernysevsky written in 1863. It's that perpetual question of Russian art and politics, and not just Russian. What are we to do? Anyway, it's called Russian Woods, and they tell this story of people pretending to be animals in the wood. The wood is a paradigm, is an analogy for Russian society. And of course, at the moment, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of anti-gay activities going on. It's rather an authoritarian place. So just to end, I'd like to show you how they've extracted newsreels to give you a view of what's going on in the Russian woods. So just a very quick look at some aspects of art and life. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We would like to move on to the next presentation by Manuel Borja-Villel. Please.
Thank you. Good morning. I'll try to speak clearly and slowly, which is almost impossible, so please bear with me. Of course, being in Reina Sofia, you cannot but begin to talk about Guernica. Certainly the icon in 20th century art about resistance, about crying against the barbarity of the military, about civil people being killed by the military, etc. As you all know, this was done by Picasso in 1937. And I'd like to discuss a little bit Guernica in terms of what it meant, in terms of what it means, and in terms of the role of a painting like this in a museum. Of course, you all know the painting was commissioned by the Spanish government in 1937 for the international fair that took place in Paris. And it's a fair that somehow in which there is a kind of continuum between war and art, between art and war. Clearly, the Spanish pavilion was a pavilion of propaganda. It was a pavilion that was done to promote, to ask for help in Spain. It was done in a moment when the Spanish Republic they almost thought that the war was lost. And there was a pavilion to show a country where people and intellectuals were together, a country that had done many things and that those things were kind of taken over by the military. And as I said, that was also like the Civil War, that fair, it was like a rehearsal of what was going to come in a few years. Actually, besides the Spanish pavilion that was kind of small, it was inviting. It was, the architect was José Sert. He was an architect that was following Le Corbusier. At the same time, you had the two buildings of the Soviet pavilion and of the Nazi pavilion, which actually they were literally looking at each other, and they were changing even the heights to show which one had more power. The Soviet that had in kind of realistic figures two proletarians, the triumph of proletarians somehow, and the Germans, the Nazis that had the imperial eagle above the building. So clearly the continuum between those elements were there. In the case of the Spanish pavilion, as I said, there was other intentions. There was more inviting. It was this element that had to do with the Mediterranean and modernism at the same time. It was a pavilion where they invited the most advanced avant-garde artists of the moment, like Julio González with the Montserrat, or like Miró in this case. And at the same time, they were putting that together with craft, with elements popular, to show that in Spain both things were together and both things were taken by the military. Also, they were showing, like you could see in the image at the left, you have a woman before the Republic and a woman after the Republic. At the end of the 19th century, Spain, when Spain lost the colonies, was a very, in general, backward country, and the Republic did lots of things in terms of education, in terms of social welfare, in terms of many things that had advanced the country. But at the same time, that was 37, there was already discussions about Stalinism, about many other things. In a way, the Spaniards, they wanted to separate themselves from Soviets and from other countries in Europe. So they introduced another element, which was Baroque, to show that there was some kind of continued element in what the Spanish Republic was trying to do. That's why they included this element of this painting by Solana, the one at your left, which clearly refers to Baroque painting. And of course Goya, because the discussion in this moment, it was also how to be an artist in a period of conflict, how to be an artist in a period where it looks like there are other things, it appears that there are other things that are more important than just art, and where art and politics are totally integrated. Of course, the big painting, the big work, it was by Picasso, it was Guernica. Guernica was commissioned in February, but actually he didn't start working really until April, until the bombing, and then he began to work like in a frenzy and did this famous painting where you have all the elements, the wounded soldier, the Madonna, etc., and the bull, which somehow is the portrait of Picasso himself, interpelling, questioning us, this element of questioning, this element of art being an element of interpellation or questioning, I think is very, very important. And I think this is actually what museums should always do. Museums should remain as places of question, as places of freedom, especially in a moment where perhaps this lack of freedom doesn't come in a brutal way like it was in the 30s, but it comes in a different way. So this is, I think, one of our functions. And of course, as Didi Uberman says, paintings do not have, or works of art do not have just one life. They have the life of their own making, but also they have many lives after that life. They live like ghosts in history. And Guernica had the history of the pavilion, but then it had other histories, like, of course, it was an icon in Spain during Franco years, and when the painting was returned in the early 80s for several years, it was in a separate building by itself, and it was protected by 2 civil guards with repetition guns, and of course, with bulletproof glass. Actually, contemporary historians, they say that the real democracy came into Spain when the Guernica was shown without protection, the way, without normal protection, the way it is now shown in Reina Sofia. But what happens when suddenly what is an icon of politics, when it's something that is part of your own history, becomes fetishized, when it becomes a market element? What happens when something that was a few years ago under bulletproof glass becomes a magnet on your refrigerator? Of course, something else is, we have a different type of violence. What does a museum has to do with all this? What happens when Picasso or Guernica becomes, this is a work by Rogelio López Cuenca, an artist from the south of Spain. When it happens when an artist like Picasso becomes the fake, of course, cover for a millionaire magazine, or what happens when a whole city like Malaga is built on the name. Malaga has 2 Picasso museums and probably very few works, really very few works on them, and the city becomes just, looks like it's living out of the name of Picasso. How can a work of art resist this element? Of course, we know that this is not something new. We know that there are many ways of absorption. We know that works of art move between radicality, between rupture and absorption. So let's go a little bit ahead. What happens with the generation after Picasso, the generation that grew they were the children of Picasso, Miró, Julio González, and that work in Spain during Franco, like Tapies, Canogar, Saura, and others. What happens when they were doing certain type of artists that were radical, that were at the moment also protesting against the dictatorship in ways, of course, that had to be subtle. There were things you could not say. But, for example, these 2 paintings by Tapies, you could clearly see in the one on your left, there are the 4 imprints of the fingers. The 4 fingers, actually, they represent the Catalan flag. That was totally forbidden at the moment. It was claiming for autonomy of the country. So those were works that were political. They were works that were claiming for freedom. But what happened, like, for example, this portrait of Philip II, a very ironical, very grotesque portrait of Philip II, which actually you could see here in Tokyo today, now by Saura. So what happens when all of that is not only an oppositional art, but becomes also the art of the regime? Actually, you see the photo below Franco doing the opening of one of those exhibitions. And also it happened that that type of art became the official art that the regime was exporting outside of Spain in spite of the artists. It's not that the artists were very happy with that, but probably they had no choice. Even more so, what happens with art that is radical, art that is against certain system, when they become the system in themselves? Like all that generation of artists from, this great generation of artists from the 50s or 60s, they became, this is Reina, Sofia in 86, the official artists. That was the opening exhibition, Tapies, Chillida. And of course, what happens when they have their own foundations, their own mausoleums in a way, they create their own temples, their own places, and almost in a military way. This is Barcelona, and if you see where the three museums by Miró, Picasso, and Tapies, they literally, they are in the outside of in the sides of the city. Two of them were where the military barracks were in the past, and in a way they're like, they have military positions in the city. And of course, what happens is that there are other types of artistic manifestations. There are other types of art that somehow disappear from history, like conceptual practices during certain type of, like a great filmmaker like Valdelomar. So what happens is that, and that reminds me of a great novel in Spanish here by the great author Henry James, called The Turn of the Screw. In The Turn of the Screw, as you know, there is the story of a family or group of few people that they keep being terrorized by ghosts. They keep seeing apparitions, and the whole novel, you could see that they are afraid of these ghosts appearing. And the problem, the terrible problem becomes at the end of the novel, when suddenly they begin to have doubts about the ghost, because maybe they are the ghost. They begin to doubt about their own reality. Maybe the others are the ones that are living. So it will not be happening that maybe in their world today, the difference between being alive and death is not that clear. Maybe it's not that clear which is our position. I think this is very important for museums, and it's very important that somehow we create these spaces of resistance, these spaces of interpellation, because otherwise, actually, yeah, I think we become the ghost. This was a terrible work by, suppose, Ligia Clark, a great Brazilian artist, that was in the Basel Art Fair, and this was a bicho meaning in Brazilian animal. And he called, they were small sculptures, and he called them bichos, animals, because they were alive. They were supposed to be moved. However, when you make an element that you can move with your hands, and you make it like 4 meters high, of course it's grotesque, it's kitsch, but also it reminds you some kind of Leviathan, some kind of big entity that is the only one that is able to move those things. Somehow, this thing reminds you very much of the Nazi and Soviet pavilion. So perhaps after all this century, after all this radical movement, we are back where we were. So again, as I said, I think we have the responsibility in museums to create a space of freedom, a space of resistance. Just to conclude, I would like to show 3 models, 3 examples of 3 artists that give us some keys. One is, of course, and I coincided with David, Hans Haacke. Not only because Hans Haacke, there is this element of self-reflectivity, this element of knowing where the institution is in society. And it's not only because it shows what, in theory, knowledge hides, but it also shows the rules by which knowledge eliminates or contains certain things, like in the case of the images at the bottom, where you have Sapolsky and company, which, as you know, is not really that Sapolsky was a trustee of the Guggenheim. What happened is that the element of information, the documentary element was not allowed in the museum. Is this form of this relationship between knowledge and power, this form of putting aside certain things, what Hans Hacke shows, and I think that's basic and important that museums take into account. And then, of course, another one is Marcel Brotars, that he also did this element of self-reflectivity. He also thought about the dispositive, the apparatus in the Foucault sense of the word, that thing that is between us and the author, this thing that somehow is not neutral, this thing that modernism had tried to make us believe didn't exist. He created a great work, which is his fictional museum, and the great element in that fictional museum, it was Section Cinema in 72. This is a recreation, where he had these works, like, for example, the one that you are seeing, which is at the same time a screen for a film, is a painting, and is also a poetry in the Mallarmé sense of the word. So you have something which moves between the media. You have something that is post-media before the post-media, but without not any kind of technical element attached. And you have also the artist telling the stories in the Benjamin sense of the word. You cannot see it in the picture, but you have him sitting in a box which is a crate for, it's part of the crates for transporting. So where you see this self-reflectivity too, you have the canon, you have you have the artist telling the history of Waterloo, the history of Belgium, but the artist, as you could see, has a big nose. He's also Pinocchio, he's a liar, he's a fictionalist, he's somebody that creates tricks that we know and that will let us to get immersed on those games. And is that playing in those tricks the element that makes art not being absorbable and makes art to be an element of resistance, and is something that I think museums should learn. And finally, Ligia Clark, coming out of abstract, coming out of Mondrian, misunderstanding Mondrian, turning Mondrian and Malevich into materialist artists, Ligia Clark, Elliott Ithica, another Latin American artist, move into real space, move into the body, and were somehow able to create a space where the spectator is emancipated, in the sense that Jacques Rancière gives to the term. So there are these three elements: self-reflectivity, this element of narrative, fictionality, the dispositive, and finally, this element of the spectator that has to become an agent, is not any longer somebody passive, is somebody that has to create its own constructions. I think what museums should do today to create this space of interpellation, this space of freedom, in a moment where knowledge, where experience, where history is absorbed, could be turned into a fetish, into a merchandise. Thank you.
Thank
you very much, Manuel. And next, Mr. Shuji Takashina, please. Thank you very much for a kind introduction. My name is Takashina. So the title is The History of Art Foretells the Future. A great poet and a novelist, Victor Hugo from France, he written Notre Dame de Paris, 1482. That's the novel that he wrote. There is an odd chapter that says, "This will kill that." It's Paris, and it's a Notre Dame Cathedral, and there is a residence beside that, and there is a young bishop would be placing his hand on a book on a table and will say this. And after that, he's going to be pointing to a cathedral outside of the window and say that, and will be saying, "This will kill that," meaning that the book will kill the cathedral.
It's 1482. The setting is in 1482. It's a time when a new technology came to be, which was the printing technology. And there was a mass production of books, now possible. And with these newly arrived books, whether it be the teachings of God and education will be conducted through books. And because of that, in the Middle Ages, people went to the church in order to get that, but the book will be replacing that, which means that the books will kill the cathedral. And it is true that in the Middle Ages, there were a lot of rules filled by the church, but with these printing materials, the books would replace the works that were conducted by the churches back then. But that's not the only thing that's taken away. The art world that were helmed by the church would also be replaced. In the Middle Ages, as shown in a lot of the illuminated manuscripts, they told about the teachings of God, but it was also very much decorated, and it was a piece of work of art in itself. And back then, Federico da Montefeltro, the Duke of Urban, who was known as a bibliophile, said that the printed books were ugly and therefore they are not going to be included in the collection in his library. The text that would be a world that will be telling the meaning and form and color, which is used in order to depict the art, they have completely been separated. Michel Foucault, a thinker in France, he wrote an article about This Is Not a Pipe by René Magritte. He said something like this: the Western and European art in the 15th century to the 20th century have been ruled by plastic representation and linguistic reference. So these were the two principles that ruled the Western art. And he also stated that these two systems can neither merge nor intersect. So let's take a look at the Middle Age transcription. As you can see, the image and the text are unified and merged as one, as a work of art. Especially if we take a look at the title page, the forms of the text and the words are well leveraged on in order to portray the significance or the definitions. For example, the I and the P-I-P-R-I-N. So this is the first word of the book of Johannes. So these text and the meaning and image are all merged as one. By the printing word that came to be in the 15th century, this took away these types of merged world. And after that, the piece of work, whether it be art, and the creators have tried to be able to merge the image and the text. This came to be in the 19th century, and it is the Moxon Tennyson poetry collection. So he have tried to be able to merge the poetry or the text and the image. And let's take a look at what happened inside. And this is the Lady of Shalott. This is the illustration by Holman Hunt, William Holman Hunt. And this is the Dante Gabriel Rossetti, also have illustrated this as well. So it is true that the text and image resides on the same page, but the text portion And the image portion, which is the illustration or the printed art, it is two separate worlds. They are completely separated. So compared to the transcription of the Middle Ages, it's tasteless. Going on to William Morris, they have used the Middle Age Gothic transcription, and he tried to be able to revive the beauty of that. And this is Geoffrey Chaucer's collection of poetry, but in UK. And you'll be able to see the illustrations and the words or the text are all residing in one page. And it is true that here the image and the text is much better merged. But still this portion, the text portion and the words within the page, it's still belonging to a different world, even if it is on the same page. The world of imagery is taken away from text as art. And with only an image, we'll be able to provide for a great narratives. And this is in Rome. It's Sistine Chapel. And the ceiling art, or the Last Judgment large mural, Michelangelo did all of this by himself, meaning that he used his hand in order to create this piece of art. And also, this is a biblical narrative. There is no text to portray the narratives. It's just about image. With only the image, through the imagination of a great artist, it gave birth to the definition and the narrative. With just an image, this world is created. To decorating an architecture by the one artist this was a great example of that in the 20th century. And this is in the South France, is in Matisse is the Chapel of Rosary in Vence, France. There is a stained glass and a mural in this chapel. And with this, Matisse has been able to create a great artistic space. As an image, of course, there will be draftsmanship in order to express forms. And there is a stained glass designed by Matisse. Will be able to incorporate colored light. So draftsmanship and colored light, they are all unified. And because of this being a chapel, we will also be able to have a very simple, beautiful altar. And these are all united to form a religious space. And this was all done by form and color. Texts are not used here. Within a 21st century artist, what Michel Foucault has said, that the text and the image will never be merged, but Matisse tried to be able to merge this. When he had worked on the Vance's chapel, he has shown his works by his hand, and also this is the Matisse's Florage d'Amour. So the poetry and the art is well united on one page. The image, the world of image, and this one is a draftsmanship, and the text by that is separated. And let's take a look at the title page. We have the Florage d'Amour de Ronsard. You will be able to see a texted title, and there is also a well-designed picture associated with that. So the text and the image is residing on the same page, but it is belonging to a different world. And Matisse, tried to be able to merge this again. And says within the poetic collection of Charles d'Orléans, on the title page, we'll be able to see the portrait and text. But he wrote this, it's a handwritten word. So the world of text and the world of image is now united. And let's take a look at the pages inside. The poems itself also are handwritten, transcripted, and it also incorporates design as well. So the lines for the text matches the designs. We have the naked woman. You have been able to see that there is a unified line work here. And jazz, which is a famous work collection, and by Matisse, which signifies that we'll be able to see a narrative included in these series of art. And the title Jazz, of course, is handwritten by Matisse. And the image depicted here, it's not just about draftsmen, but he also used cutouts. There is a work called Circus, and there would be the words as well. This is included in a series called Jazz. And you'll be able to see the forms and the colors and the text. Also, there would be participating as a form of art. The Michel Foucault said that the world of text and the world of image will completely be separated. But these two worlds actually has been well integrated into one works of art in order to create a merged world. In a Western art, it is true that the print became a new technology, and that provided greater benefits, whether it be education or the news and communications. Print has been able to fulfill many roles, but at the same time, the art and the world of image were separated away, which depicts the aesthetics of human beings. So, taking 300 years to 400 years, the artists have been able to recreate a world in which these two are reunited. And when we take a look at this history in retrospect, the expression and the communication functionality, which is fulfilled by words, how would we be able to merge these into one world? We have been able to see how this happened by looking back in the Western art. Let's take a look at the art outside of the Western world. There is a world where that separation did not exist, like Foucault said. For example, in Japan, the text and the image always formulated the one world. It was something completely different, but they were all residing in the same page, and it is being merged in order to depict one world. And this is the fan paper album of Hokkekyo Sutra. And as you can see, you will be able to see the mode of life. We have the buildings, we have the children, we have women working. So this is the mode of life. And on top of this, you will be able to see the Lotus Sutra words written. It seems like these two worlds are separated, but as a piece of a formulated world of art, it is united. The words, well, the kanjis, aesthetics, and also hiragana, which is specific to Japan, which is fluid, they have the formulative power. This is another example of that. This is in the 17th century. This tradition continued into the 17th century and the Edo era after that, and also in the Muromachi era before that. All of these historical pieces show this merged world. One of the example of this is the Tawaraya Sodatsu wrote the art, and on top of that, Honami Koetsu wrote the text or a poem. And this is a scroll. So it is a very long piece of work. This is a part of that long scroll, and have used the gold background. And on top of that gold background, we have been able to use the silver to show lines of cranes. It is a very well designed piece of work. And on top of that, Koetsu wrote about Kakinomoto no Hitomaro's poem. So this is all written on top of each other. It's overlapping each other, but there's a call and response. As a characteristic of Japanese, there will be the kanji characters and the hiragana characters. And so because of that, formulatively speaking, there is a complex forms, and there also is a fluid, simplified letters, which are all unified. And this is Kakinomoto no Hitomaro's poem, Waka poem. And you will be able to see the very thin line, which is the shi letter. And that is a long, and that when the shi letters are used, it is always used as a long line. And that goes through the cause and response with the thin legs of the crane. So the formulative power of those letters, which also includes a significance or a meaning, and also the meaning of that the drawings are all unified into one, and then are all united in order to create and depict one scene. I believe that is a tradition in Japan, meaning that this has continued from the Middle Ages all the way to the contemporary days. And there is a block painter, Shiko Munakata, which is a representative artist in the 20th century, and there is a woodcut print. And Shiko Munakata actually have going through creating the woodcut print, and they would also go through the painting, and this is woodcut print, so you will be able to have numerous pieces, but the colors are also hand painted by him. You see the letters here, and he's using katakana and the kanji. The plum smells, and the snow is still there. When there's still a snow, there's already the fragrant plum smell wafting in the air. Yanagiya Soetsu's Kokoro Uta. This is a poem by him. You'll be able to see the forms, which is the flower of the plums, and also the snow in the winter. These imageries are united into one. So this is a world that depicts both. And there are numerous works by Munakata with a similar theme, and many other artists have done this as well. So the possibility of the expression by human, we will be able to learn from the past works as well. When we think about what the future will be for the art, I will not be able to become a prophet. But no matter the methodology, there will always be the unique imagination of the artist like Michelangelo. And there would also be the rich aesthetics that is nurtured by the past tradition. And also the hand craftsmanship that will create that. Of course, CG is possible through new technologies in the 21st century, but we need the imagination and hand craftsmanship, which will give birth to richness. And the aesthetics that's based on a tradition. I believe merging these two into one will give birth to a great piece of art in the future, and I hope that will be real. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite David, Manuel on the stage as well. So we had 3 presentations looking at different aspects, all very inspiring indeed. David gave us a very global presentation based on his global experience and global perspective. Changes in society, political change, and how artists have responded to those changes. He has shown us many examples of that. And Manuel focused mainly on the history of Spain, talked about the roles of the museum as well. And Mr. Takashina, I think, really focused on the changes in technology, handwriting, drawing, to printing, and how art has responded to those changes in technology. I'm going to switch to English now.
David, you have shown a number of examples of interesting artists. They responded to the social political changes. And what makes it different from the actual act of revolution from artistic activities?
Well, I mean, good politics doesn't necessarily make good art. And it's this bleeding off of quality in art into other things. And of course, part of that quality is stuff with which it's dealing, of course, if you like, the subject. And the subject and the object are often the same thing also. And as you were both saying, the artist's own reflexivity, through which they create this language, which we as observers are invited to learn, or this world which we're invited to experience. But it doesn't just end there. I mean, art is not made in a vacuum, as much as some artists would like it to be, and that their own intention controls forever how a work will always be seen. This is ridiculous. I think it's fair to say that most of us working in creative activities, we don't know what it is we've done until we've done it. And I think this is particularly true for art. You can't really see it. You can't say it's there and you have some distance from it. And the same thing for others. And it's actually, and I think this is one of the things, it's been within modernity from Duchamp onwards and perhaps a little bit before, but this, would say, discursive aspect, this discursive strain of contemporary art has become increasingly important from the 1990s to the present. So much so that it's actually, I believe, the most important element going. So, I mean, if you go to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, you see rooms and rooms and rooms of fairly hermetic artworks, of works which are made by great masters, and they're finished, and they more or less stay the same. People interpret them differently. But when you go into the room with Duchamp, you're seeing a number of strategic options and propositions about art itself and the nature of the world. And I think we are, I wouldn't say one is better than the other. They're there. They often come together in the same work, but they're absolutely vital now, because I think that transmission and the reception of the work of art is as important as the production. And I would actually say this has always been the case.
And that could be one of the criteria to judge it's good art, that could transcend the time and history.
Yeah, which of course you have to give it time to know whether it will. But as professionals working in it, we're like people working with horses and horse racing. we look at these and we look at their fetlocks and their teeth and the way they walk and trot, and we make suppositions about whether they might be winners or not. But it goes a little bit deeper than that, because you're looking at them in relationship to other works of art within a matrix of culture. And so there's an awful lot of work to do to be in a position whereby one can do that. But it's absolutely vital, I think, particularly if you're working in a professional public sphere. I mean, if you're working for commercial gallery or auction house or even a private collector, you do what you want. Or commercial sphere, you're doing what you can sell. You know, of course you like art and you're interested in other things, but that's your job. Whereas if you're working in the public field, I really do believe you need to take a very broad view and constantly be testing your own views about quality and what's important and what's not. And I've just had to unlearn so much that I was taught as part of this process, and I hope I continue doing that and learn new things as my perspectives change.
Thank you. I'd like to then ask Manuel, you mentioned about the importance of self-reflection and narratives. And when you show these, you also mentioned about the shift of the meaning and understanding of the work like Guernica from political symbol to the magnet on the refrigerator. And how do you activate the original meaning of the works that has, for instance, in your collection, that could be speaking to the generation in 20 years later or 100 years later?
Well, first questioning the idea of originality, because there is not an original meaning. As I said, following Didi Uberman, there are many meanings. There are works of art live many lives, and I think it's important to know that. I think it's also important to understand that we live in a contemporary world, and contemporary world, I think, implies at least two things. One is globalization, of course, and globalization means that there are countries that are contemporary, but they might have not been modern. So that means a different meaning of history. That means also, and that goes to what David was saying, I mean, not by chance, Barthes in the early 80s talk about the death of the late 70s, about the death of the author. And actually we live the contemporary, the art that comes from, and the institutions that come from the 80s until now, they have made more emphasis on the spectator than in the authors. In a way, the author is very important. In a way, the author is the one that has to complete the works. So all that considered, knowing also that the industries of communications are very strong, are all over, knowing that we are, at least in Europe, we are suffering a kind of, again, second neoliberal revolution, and where the public sphere is kind of, or the idea of institutions and public service, and there I agree also with David, is disappearing, and it's very important to keep. We are being forced, we have, let's say, pressures for many levels. On the one hand, to be self-efficient, to produce, to get money. Money, in a way, of that quick money is against knowledge. I mean, at least it's antagonistic. It's, this quick money, it implies a quick experience and people moving, more people coming, and it's just the opposite of a slow rhythm. It's the opposite of, as I said, knowledge. Is the opposite of art. Art is useless. Art is revolutionary because, and it will be always revolutionary. It can never create a government. It can never be, let's say, official and being radical. And it is so because it's useless. I mean, it has no value in that sense. And I think it's very important that institutions create, especially in a moment where criticism doesn't have the power or doesn't have the place that it used to have in the 50s, create values. How we do that, going back, sorry, I'm Spanish, I go around and around. How do we do that in museums? I would say in three things, basically, as I mentioned. First, questioning the institution itself, questioning the way institutions organize, and that's politics. politics in a way that is not about content, it's about structure. And that's very important, and we have no choice, because the institution is being questioned from above and from below. From above, by governments, by trustees, by people that want us to go in one direction. And from below, at least in Europe, because you have all the movement of Occupy Wall Street, you have all those people trying to think politics in a different way, trying to think about the commons, trying to think about new forms of citizenship. And that we cannot be, we have to be open, we have to create platforms of discussion. So that's one, which is, I think, is basic. Second, to create narrative structures that I would say that they should be based on this element of self-reflectivity, in this element of the dispositive, in what Edouard Glissant used to call orality, which implies that the spectator is an agent, implies that the spectator should be able to create their own histories, not in a passive consumeristic way, but in a way where he becomes part of the history. I think those are basically the elements that somehow we should work on to deal with all those elements of history.
Thank you very much. 最後に高橋先生。
Lastly, Mr. Takashina, you have presented a perspective of technology, how expression of art responded to the changing technologies, and hand drawing shifted to printed art. Today we have art expressions which includes photography, video, internet, many of new art based on new technologies. So the changes in technology, the changes at the time are actually used by contemporary artists. They can use available technologies to expand the scope of expression. Is it possible? Yes, I do agree. Since in this session we look back on history, so I talked about the wood print. It is one technology of printing. Matisse actually uses a new printing technology. Including that, we do see many new expressions being born and generated. A piece of work of art. John Ruskin used to say that it is made of many different dimensions. Maybe that is one expression to talk to emotions, maybe linguistic messages to send a message. There are multiple faces of art. When I talk about image and the language, the religious messages were to be transmitted. And as David said, we have messages, political messages, responding to the social upheavals. But to do this, we use words. Some of the examples used by two speakers, there are ways to use text as well. Therefore, when you look at artwork, of course, art will change and evolve based on changing technologies, advancing technologies. It could be a piece of picture, may be good or bad, or poorly made. Even utilizing new technologies, there are different degrees of quality of art. How a wider society perceive this and recognize this. For us, we believe that our museum plays multiple roles. One, like Reina Sofia National Museum plays. We have to protect our cultural assets and artistic works. At the same time, we have to be connected with society by sending messages to the society. At the same time, we are also asked to grow as changing times. So we want to collect the work created by young artist. Shiko Munakata is from Ohara Museum, which is the representative artist or painter of the 20th century. And we have collection of 20th artists. We also have 21st century arts like moving images and other new media. All of these should be packaged so that we can propose to the society. That is one very important role that the museum should play. Like other museums, or Ohara Museum is committed to play that role as well.
About the difficulties of looking at the works from other parts of the world. You have been to different places and all around the world. And but we sometimes feel that the difficulties of telling the story about the social political background of each work when it's faced to the ordinary audience.
Yeah, well, I wasn't born knowing anything about contemporary art in Britain. In fact, I wasn't terribly interested in British contemporary art. I'm much more interested in German when I started. You learn. And you learn from, firstly, your limited experience, because one is young, and you read around it. And I think it is important to read the literature and the history and to know something about the context within which things are being done. And it's really a discipline of approaching art and the respect for it, and being prepared to do that work. And as it's my profession, I'm very happy doing it. I'd rather do that than anything else. So, and I think people have this idea of difficulty. Oh, you know, Japanese people are so inscrutible. Oh, no, they're not. You probably don't know. It's a cliche. Mm-hmm. And neither is the art. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's full of passion and jokes, wonderfully crude jokes, if you want to look at those kinds of things. And the most elegant beauty, refinement, and everything, you know, many of which we don't have in our culture. But that's good. You learn something, you experience something in a different way. And, you know, I mean, it sounds, you know, one can partly live one's life through art, which isn't bad. No one gets hurt that way.
It's interesting to sort of suggest our positive participants to the work itself and then also the context. But then I also wanted to ask Manuel about your position, because you're a national museum, and I have seen numbers of interesting exhibitions at your museum, which is very much sort of politically engaged and socially engaged. And do you also find it difficult to have your position as a national museum and artists' sort of resistance to the government system and the nation state?
Okay. Of course, the thing is to be national museum in an international global world is some kind of anachronism in a way. I mean, national museums are still based on a kind of 19th century idea. On the other hand, Europe is becoming more and more nationalistic in different ways. So I think it's very important. So I would not say it's a matter of political difficulty of doing things that it might be might bother the politicians or might bother. I think it's a matter of creating a space of freedom. I mean, that's where things have a place where there is antagonism, and that antagonism starts in many levels. I mean, one level, and that's following what David was saying, is about how you learn about the other, how you learn, how you become, how you could be national in an international, in a global period. And I think we have to realize, we have to take as a model the way we learn. We learn the world looking at the world, but we learn also the way the world look at us. I mean, it's always a double relationship. Otherwise, we are totally close. So to be a national museum, it can only be by relating to the world. I mean, being local, but at the same time relating to the world system. Again, going back to the politics, how you defend how you, I think it's a matter of, as I said, creating elements that are logical to each other, that make sense in the museum, that make sense in the collection. And of course, you have always people that would not agree or would not like it. Not only politicians. I mean, you cannot believe how many local artists could be everywhere. And when you are in a national museum, there is this idea, which is a false, a very populistic idea, which is because the museum is public, the money is public, you have the obligation to show and to represent everybody. That's populistic. It's like if you go to the European Bank and you say, this part of the money is ours, is mine, and of course it's yours, but you cannot take it, because otherwise it would be impossible. So in the museum it's the same. It's public, it's a public service, but a public service doesn't mean that it should be is public in the sense that it serves to the public. It doesn't mean that everything is okay. And to create this space of discourse, I think this is the of freedom. I think this is the role of a museum director and the role of the staff.
Thank you. 高橋先生、最後に、
Mr. Takashina, you talked about the Middle Age on the Western art and the relationship of the text and image. And you also talked about the Japanese art as well. The Western art and the Japanese art. And with regard to this East-West discussion, is something that has continued for an extended amount of time. So there might be the ambiguity or the double meaning in the Japanese art is a topic of discussion. And with this in mind, when we think about the future, it might, the difference in literature and history, which direction do you think it is going towards? It depends on how you look at the future. That is a difficult problem. I don't have any answer. But of course, there is a cultural difference between every culture. It's not just about the West and the East or Japan, but there are other cultures with a different cultural idiosyncrasy that gave birth to art. But why is it great? That's a matter of the sensibility of the person who receives it. There might be something that is hard to understand, but some might think that this work is great. There is a difference in how you feel it. And the text, it is very clear. In the West, you use the alphabets, and in Japan and China, you use the kanji, the Chinese characters, and there will always be the word of text. The form would be different, but the role is the same. Communicating the message, or trying to be able to sing the song of your heart. So that's about cultural change. And how these created the culture, and how these culture can communicate with a different culture. That is a role that needs to be fulfilled by artists. With just the language, you will not be able to understand, but in the world of aesthetics, and if you think something is great, then you will be able to use that as an expression in order to comprehensively communicate, and that is an area where art can play a role. We have a specific expressionistic method. Of course, there are some art that is going to be proving it, but so what kind of a culture do these arts portray? Of course, we have to have ownership for the history as well. But that also, how it's going to be portrayed is going to be the role of the artist. And there is another role or responsibility that we need to bear as an audience.
最後にデイビッドにですね、
And lastly, this is a question for David. Ever since you were a director of the Mori Art Museum, you always talked about good art. There's not a lot of people that will be sending out a strong message of absolute good art. And I've continued to think about what that means. So would you be able to share with us the piece of advice in order to find good art?
Well, it's certainly not about creating a canon. And there's not just one idea of quality. There are many different ideas of quality. But what I do myself when I'm spending time with art, I start always by asking my question, is this any good? Am I getting anything out of this experience? And I mean, I always do it because without that, I really could be making a lot more money doing something else, which I maybe didn't enjoy as much, but it has to be about quality and this active process of discrimination in the most positive way. And there's no one answer, there's no one good, perish the thought. But again, it's educating oneself through life and, dare one use the word, connoisseurship. It's very unfashionable to use the word, but it's not so bad because it actually means getting to know things. Connaissez, to get to know someone. And art is like that. It's so multifaceted. It's like a personality, a human personality. There can be a bad side to it and the good side. It can be a beautiful thing about horrible things. So, and that's what makes it so fascinating. And I do believe museums are there to help mediate, not to tell people what they should feel or think, but firstly to show it, to provide the experience so people can begin to engage and make up their own minds. And then if they want further information, you can give them a toolbox with which to work with, and discussion, and all those other things start to kick in. But first of all, it's the only field I know of art, going to an art museum, where you're not being told what to think or do. No one's bossing you around. You can dislike it, and that's perfectly okay. Not everyone's going to like it. Where do you get that freedom? You know, you don't get it from political ideology. You don't get it from religion. They're full of rules. What you have is an intelligence and a keen intelligence and sensibility of different artists brought to bear on culture, and there it's there for you to take, enjoy whatever you want out of it. How fantastic! Where do you get that freedom anywhere else?
ありがとうございました。短い時間でしたけれども、
Thank you very much. We went over the history and we tried to discuss based on the theme of the history of art foretelling the future. Museums are the space where you can have the freedom, and that was a very encouraging message. Thank you very much. David Elliott, Manuel Jose Borja-Villel, Shuji Takashina, and Mami Kataoka. Please join me in thanking them with a big round of applause. Thank you very much.